In April of 1841, a South Carolina planter named Silas Rutledge made an announcement that left even the most ruthless slaveholders stunned. He declared that his own daughter Catherine, a 28-year-old woman weighing more than 260 pounds, would be placed under the complete authority of an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross, not as her caretaker, not as her companion, but as her master in every way that mattered except by law. The white families of Colleton County were scandalized, whispering behind closed doors, but none of them realized what Rutledge was truly setting in motion, or what Ezekiel would do to Catherine in the months that followed. By November, Catherine's body had changed in ways no one could explain. 13 men lay dead, and Cypress Grove Plantation was reduced to ashes. What really happened between the daughter of a desperate planter and the man who was forced to hold power over her? What unspeakable acts did he commit that left every witness terrified? Before I uncover the truth, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and tell me what state you are watching from. Spring in Colleton County brought a heavy heat that clung to the air like a second skin. The Combe River drifted lazily through the low country, its dark surface reflecting the long gray veils of Spanish moss swaying from live oaks like funeral banners. Rice fields stretched in every direction, their flooded rows filled with enslaved workers bent to the waist in knee-deep water from dawn until nightfall. This was wealth wrung from suffering prosperity built on misery, and the men who profited convinced themselves it was the natural order of the world. Cypress Grove sat on 800 acres of middling land. Silas Rutledge owned 58 enslaved people of fortune by most standards, but still small compared to the families who ruled the county. Those men commanded thousands of acres, and hundreds of slaves spent their summers in Charleston, sent their sons north to college, and carried names that could elevate or destroy with a single word. Silas wanted that kind of power, but never quite reached it. He had married Elizabeth Yancey in 1812, gaining her modest land and respected name. She was practical and sharp with numbers, more concerned with profits than appearances. But she died the next year, giving birth to Catherine. For nearly 3 decades, Silas raised his only child alone, pouring his energy into chasing social acceptance. He was tall and gaunt, with gray hair that came too soon and a severe face that matched his cold temperament. In business, he was shrewd but reliable, a man known to drive bargains hard but honor his word. Catherine grew up isolated, tutored at home, never part of society, never fully belonging anywhere. By 1841, she was 28 and weighed close to 260 pounds, her body bloated from years of useless medicines prescribed for so-called female disorders. She suffered violent fits, sometimes screaming and hurling objects. The year before, she had slashed her father's hand with a letter opener, leaving a scar that still drew stares. Neighbors whispered false sympathy, pitying Silas for being cursed with a mad daughter who had once been so pretty. They never knew the truth. They never knew what Catherine had seen at 12 years old, or that her outbursts were not madness at all, but the only sane reaction to living among monsters. On April 7th, a courier delivered a letter to Cypress Grove. Silas opened it in his study, expecting routine business. Instead, he found 3 pages of fine paper sealed in red wax, stamped with a symbol he recognized instantly. And from that moment, nothing in Colleton County would ever be the same. A scythe crossed with wheat stalks, the mark of the Brethren of the Harvest. They were 13 men bound by secrecy, gathering in the dark to perform rituals they believed fed the land with power drawn from blood. Their ceremonies blended old European superstitions with spiritual knowledge stolen from the enslaved. And their creed was simple: the strong must consume the weak, even literally, when it served their purpose. Silas Rutledge had joined them in 1822. Over the next 19 years, he attended dozens of their rites, some unsettling, others monstrous. By 1841, the brethren held his fate in their hands. The letter he received that spring reminded him of his debt, $12,000 squandered on gambling and failed ventures, a ruinous sum that would wipe out everything he owned. Paying it would mean selling off most of his land and all of his slaves, leaving him broken. But the brethren offered another way. There was, they wrote, a demonstration expected from men who found themselves in desperate straits. Silas was to take his daughter Catherine and place her under the absolute control of one of his enslaved men. Not as a punishment, not for show, but as a true transfer of authority lasting an entire year. The man would command every aspect of her life, her movements, her body, her treatment. Silas would even announce it before the county's elite, disguising it as a radical medical remedy for her unstable condition. The shame would be staggering. In a society that claimed to prize white women above all else, Silas would be declaring his daughter less valuable than the people he bought and sold. Yet the promise was too tempting. His debt forgiven, his fortune restored, his standing preserved. The alternative was ruin, and perhaps worse, since the brethren's reach extended into every court, every office, every seat of power. He knew what choice they expected. The same choice men like him had been trained to make all their lives: property over people, power over morality. Before dawn, by candlelight, he scrawled his acceptance. 3 days later, another letter arrived. It named the man. Ezekiel Cross, age 33, recently purchased from Virginia, carpenter, herbalist, obedient by temperament. That was the story on paper. What it did not say was that Ezekiel had been chosen deliberately, that his presence at Cypress Grove was no accident, and that behind his quiet manner burned a patient, unyielding hunger for justice. On April 13th, a wagon rolled into the plantation yard. Unlike most slave deliveries, this one drove straight to the main house. Silas stepped out onto the porch, blinking into the sun. In the wagon bed sat Ezekiel. The first thing Silas noticed were his eyes. Most enslaved men kept their gaze lowered to survive. Ezekiel did not. He looked directly at Silas, calm, measuring, unafraid. It unsettled him immediately. Ezekiel stood tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the hardened strength of a life in labor. His skin showed no scars of the whip. His hands were rough, yes, but his fingers carried a precision that spoke of craft, not just brute force. Henderson, the trader, climbed down and handed over the papers. Ezekiel Cross, as requested. His previous owner vouched for his quiet nature. Your associates wanted you to know this one was chosen with care. Silas barely glanced at the parchment. He looked instead at Ezekiel. You understand why you are here? Yes, sir, came the answer, slow and steady, his Virginia accent wrapping each word. My daughter is unwell. You will be responsible for her care. Doctors have failed. You claim to know herbal treatments. My grandmother was a healer, sir. She taught me before I was sold. The deal ended as quickly as it began. Ezekiel was led to a cabin near the main house, set apart from the other quarters, given a few supplies, and told his duties would start the next morning. His only task was Catherine. His failure would not be tolerated. Ezekiel nodded once. Yes, sir. When the door finally shut and the footsteps faded, Ezekiel let his mask slip. His jaw loosened, his shoulders eased, and for the first time since his arrival, he allowed himself to breathe. Sitting on the narrow bed of the cabin, he reached under his shirt and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside lay a worn scrap of paper with 3 names written in a child's shaky hand: Sarah Benjamin Ruth. His wife, his son, his daughter. Sold away from him 3 years ago to an Alabama plantation notorious for grinding slaves to death. Within 18 months, They were gone. Sarah from untreated fever, Benjamin from an infected injury, Ruth from despair. At 6 years old, she simply stopped eating. Silas Rutledge had sold them himself, not from need, not from punishment, but to prove to the brethren he could be ruthless. Ezekiel had watched his family torn apart, so a secret society could be impressed by a man's lack of sentiment. For 2 years, Ezekiel had moved deliberately south, one plantation to the next. Always listening, always gathering names. He learned about the brethren through whispers. Their rituals, their arrogance, their belief, they were untouchable. When the chance came to be purchased by Rutledge, he took it. This was the access he had been waiting for, to the house, to its secrets, to the man who had destroyed his life. Justice would not come from laws or courts. It would come from patience, from planning, from becoming exactly as monstrous as the men he hunted. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it back under his shirt, then lay back on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, already shaping the steps to come. His first day began April 14th. Judith, a middle-aged house slave with graying hair and weary eyes, led him up the stairs to Catherine's room. She knocked softly, hesitant. "Miss Catherine, your father has brought someone to help with your treatments." A crash answered her, something heavy striking the wall. A slurred, venomous voice followed. "I do not want more treatments. Send him away." Judith looked at Ezekiel, sympathy flickering across her face. "She has bad days. This is one." Ezekiel opened the door without another word and stepped inside, shutting it before Judith could follow. The room was large, but dim curtains drawn tight. The air was sour with stale bedding and something sweeter metallic, the smell of mercury. Books littered the floor. A framed picture lay shattered against the wall. Clothing was strewn everywhere. Catherine sat slumped in a chair by a cold fireplace, wrapped in a stained dressing gown. Her dark hair hung in a tangle. Her face was swollen eyes, unfocused hands trembling against the armrests. She stared at Ezekiel, confusion giving way to fear, then to anger. "Who are you?" I said. "No more doctors." "I'm not a doctor, miss," he said evenly. "My name is Ezekiel. Your father asked me to help you." "Help!" Her laugh was harsh and bitter. "That's what they all say. Help, treatment, medicine. They mean poison. They mean chains. They mean silence." She lurched to her feet, swaying. "I know what this is. He's punishing me again for remembering, for speaking, for refusing to forget." Ezekiel didn't move. His stillness was disarming. "What are you supposed to forget?" The question stopped her. Anger flickered into something rawer, more fragile. "You don't know." "I know nothing, miss," he said softly. "Only that your father says you're unwell." Catherine studied him as if seeing him for the first time. "You're not from here." "Virginia originally, miss." "Do you know what happens in this house?" "What they do in the cellar." Ezekiel's pulse ticked faster, but his face stayed neutral. "I don't know what you mean." "Liar." There was no heat in it, just exhaustion. "Everyone lies. It's easier than truth." She sank back into the chair. "Tell my father his newest torment failed." Instead, Ezekiel crossed to the window and pulled open the curtains. Sunlight flooded the room. Catherine gasped and covered her eyes. "When did you last go outside, Miss Town?" "I can't walk that far. I'm too weak." "When did you last eat without feeling sick?" "A minute." "The medicine is necessary?" "Doctors say so." "What if the doctors are wrong?" Her hands dropped from her eyes. She stared at him. Hope and terror mingled. "What did you say?" "I said, what if the doctors are wrong? What if everything you've been told about your condition isn't meant to cure you, but to keep you weak, to keep you quiet? What if your father has been poisoning you for years to make sure you can't speak about what you saw?" Silence. Catherine's trembling stopped. She sat motionless, her mind turning. When she finally spoke, her voice was clearer. "He told you. Your father told me nothing," Miss Ezekiel replied. "But I have eyes. I know mercury poisoning. I know what long-term use does. Healthy women don't become like this unless someone works hard to make them that way." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping back. "Why would you say this?" Ezekiel told her it was a trick and that he could help her get well. But it would be hard. Her body depended on those medicines for years, and likely to get worse before it got better, and he said he had reasons to want Silas Rutledge to suffer, because the surest way to make Silas suffer was to give him back a daughter who could remember and speak. And Catherine, damaged but not stupid, listened and weighed the offer, testing whether his motives and hers could align. When she asked if he wanted revenge on her father, he admitted he did, explaining that Silas had sold Ezekiel's wife and 2 children to a brutal Alabama plantation where they died within months. And Catherine, who already knew about the brethren, laughed a little and told him she wanted every man who had stood in that cellar to suffer and then die, naming her father and other local men. By the end, the venom in her voice surprising Ezekiel because it came from someone others called mad. And when she confessed she had killed 3 house slaves in past lucid moments, then smiled about how their disappearances had been explained away, Ezekiel felt ice run down his spine but kept his steadiness and promised not to betray her, and Catherine, steadying herself, laid down one condition after their revenge. She wanted to die because she could not live with what she had seen and done, and Ezekiel committed. Now agreed, they sealed the pact with a hesitant handshake that surprised him with its strength. And in the week that followed, Ezekiel began breaking down her dependency, slowly tapering the laudanum, replacing doses with herbal tinctures he trusted, valerian root for sleep and anxiety, chamomile for the stomach, milk thistle to help her liver process toxins, and the withdrawal was brutal, with 3 days of fevers, shaking, and vomiting that Ezekiel stayed through, holding a basin, wiping her face, speaking softly so she knew she was not alone. And when the worst passed, she was weaker but clearer, tremors easing, speech less slurred, able to read again. And then the real work began, as he had her walk short distances, inching farther. Each day tightened her diet to lean meats and vegetables instead of pastries she had used for comfort, enforced strict portions which she fought at first, and while rebuilding her body they talked, and finally she began to tell him about the cellar and what she had seen when she was 12. She told him everything in a way that made his stomach turn, and he listened without interrupting. She described years of gaslighting her father, convincing everyone, including her, that she was mad, and that her memories could not be trusted, and she told him about the hidden journal where she recorded dates and times when her father left late at night, strange visitors, and the impossible sounds from the cellar. While Ezekiel told her about his own losses, about Sarah, who sang and taught their children to read, about Benjamin, who could do sums that amazed overseers, about Ruth, who picked wildflowers to make their cabin beautiful, and how Silas came to the Virginia plantation with a buyer's warrant, inspected them like livestock, agreed to buy them, and then changed the terms to take the woman and children and leave Ezekiel behind, splitting the family simply because he could. And smiling while he did it, a memory Ezekiel could not forget. The image of his son clinging to his leg, and his wife urging Benjamin to be brave, while Silas looked pleased. Catherine listened with eyes suddenly clear, and said she was sorry for what he had suffered, then added that sorrow was only a word, and she was responsible for what she would do next, promising Ezekiel that Silas would pay, and that they would all pay. And the formal announcement came on April 29th, when 41 people filled the Cypress Grove dining room under the pretense of an important family announcement. The county elite arriving in carriages, Judge Pelham with his wife Eleanor, Reverend Crenshaw with his daughter Marcus Fanning, and family Benjamin Lyle from the bank. The meal elaborate with oysters, roasted duck, multiple rice dishes, sweet potatoes, fresh bread, and a towering cake for dessert. While Catherine sat at her father's right hand, eating sparingly and saying nothing, beyond polite replies as Ezekiel moved among the servants. invisible to most, but listening and filing away every detail until after dessert. Silas tapped his glass and told the room that Catherine had been unwell and the doctors had failed until Ezekiel's herbal treatments improved her, then declared that Ezekiel would assume full responsibility for her care with complete authority over her person and treatment effective immediately, a revelation that drew shocked murmurs and objections from guests like Marcus Fanning and Reverend Crenshaw, but that Silas shut down by insisting on his decision and saying Catherine agreed, and Catherine, in the moment that could have exposed everything, smiled small and controlled, and said she trusted her father as judgment and that Ezekiel had been kind, though Ezekiel saw her knuckles white on her napkin and the flash in her eyes promising violence. Understanding, she played the obedient role, while inside she burned. The night ending with awkward conversation and private questions to Silas about wisdom and the brethren, and later alone in her room after everyone had left. She told Ezekiel she wanted to burn the house down with everyone in it, but would be patient because that was their strategy, to let them feel secure before the pain came, and Ezekiel answered that he had agreed for the same reason. She wanted them to write her off as her father's oddity to let the county forget her while they worked, and she turned to Ezekiel and asked if he had seen their faces. The disgust, the pity, how they thought her pathetic and harmless, while they had no idea what was being planned, and when he asked what exactly they were planning, she moved to her dresser and opened a wooden box full of papers. In her hand, papers covered in years of careful handwriting. Dates, names, ritual notes coded so any finder would see nonsense. But she could decode it, and she said they had enough to destroy 20 men, though no one would believe a recently recovered woman and an enslaved man without physical proof. Which was why she had focused on one page in particular. The ledger the brethren kept, the account book of rituals, sacrifices, and members that made everyone equally guilty. And she told him it was hidden in the cellar, in a locked room beyond the main chamber. Something she had only heard about, but never seen, where they stored everything they could not afford to lose. And Ezekiel felt a rush that was part dread and part hope, because such a ledger would be devastating evidence. But getting it meant entering the brethren's domain, timing it when the house was quiet. And Catherine told him her father would be in Charleston from May 14th to the evening of May 16th, giving them almost 3 days, and for 2 weeks they prepared in hushed plans mapping the cellar from memory, tracing slave schedules and guard shifts, sketching layouts and hiding places. While Catherine improved, losing weight, gaining focus, walking farther each day, translating more of her coded journals, until Ezekiel learned that the brethren were not only Culleton County men, but part of a network spanning Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and Richmond. Men who clothed stolen beliefs in old European cult practices, mixed with stolen knowledge from enslaved people, and turned them into a monstrous justification for dominance. Sometimes sacrificing animals, sometimes people. No one would miss dumping bodies in swampy places where alligators and rot would take care of evidence. And the ledger, she said, recorded 40 years of rituals, names, dates, and descriptions because mutual complicity protected them all. So on the night of May 14th, after Silas left early, they waited until the house settled, met in Catherine's room where she had changed into plain dark clothes and pulled her hair back like someone getting ready for battle. And at 10 they slipped to the kitchen where a pantry panel pressed in the right spot clicked open to reveal narrow stairs down into the cellar. The air that hit them thick with damp earth, old smoke, and something rotten. And as they descended with a battered, shuttered lantern casting a pool of small light, the boards groaned underfoot, and Ezekiel felt the weight of what they were about to do settle in his chest. Every step taking them closer to the secrets that could tear apart South Carolina's most powerful families. After 20 steps, they reached the bottom. The cellar was far larger than Ezekiel had imagined, 30 feet square with low ceilings held up by thick wooden beams. The floor was packed earth, the stone walls weeping moisture. In the center sat what Catherine called the altar, though it now looked like only a heavy wooden table. Dark stains across its surface and shallow grooves along the edges told the real story. Around the room stood candle holders, clay jars sealed with wax wooden boxes, a rack of black robes trimmed in crimson. One wall held shelves of books and papers. Catherine moved with the certainty of someone following a memorized map. She led Ezekiel to the far wall where the stones looked solid. Pressing one particular block, they heard a soft click. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a smaller chamber about 10 feet square. Here the brethren kept its deepest secrets. In the middle of the room stood a wooden stand holding a massive ledger 2 feet tall and nearly 18 inches wide, bound in dark leather with metal clasps. Smaller journals sat beside it. Shelves along the walls held jars Ezekiel refused to examine too closely. Catherine pointed her whisper thin. "That is what we need." Ezekiel crossed to the stand and opened the book carefully. Thick parchment pages covered in neat, meticulous handwriting. Names and dates stretching back to 1800. Ritual descriptions written in a tone as clinical as a scientific experiment. With each entry, his horror grew. This was not occasional violence. This was a system. Regular gatherings every 6 weeks, rituals timed to planting and harvest, all to feed the land. At least 37 people killed, probably more. Mostly enslaved men and women, but also poor whites, indigenous captives, anyone the brethren considered expendable. Notes about consumption described in matter-of-fact detail pieces of victims prepared and eaten during ritual meals to absorb power. "Dear God," Ezekiel whispered. "I tried to tell you," Catherine said flatly. "I watched them when I was 12. Watched them cut a woman apart on that table. Watched my father raise a goblet and drink. Then spent 16 years being told I was insane. That I imagined it. But I knew." Ezekiel flipped ahead, searching for his family. He found it in an entry dated October 1838, purchased family unit from Virginia. Woman Sarah. Children Benjamin and Ruth. Separated from male to demonstrate resolve. Sent to Alabama contact. Payment received. 3 lines. That was all his family's destruction merited. "We need to take this," Ezekiel said, his voice shaking with rage. "No." Catherine put a hand on his arm. "If we take it now, they'll know. We need to copy the most important entries first." She was right. Revenge demanded patience. Burning everything would only warn them. For 3 hours they worked. Catherine had brought paper and ink copying the rituals that named current members. Ezekiel listed victims' names and dates that could be cross-checked later. The work was exhausting, the content sickening. Several times Ezekiel's hands shook so badly he had to stop. Once Catherine left the chamber, entirely overcome by memories. But each time they returned and kept going page by page, building their case. They were so focused, they didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs. The first sign was a sudden flare of lantern light in the outer chamber, far brighter than their single-shuttered lamp. Ezekiel's head snapped up, blood going cold. Silas Rutledge stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 other men. More figures crowded behind them, at least 4 in the main cellar. "I must admit," Silas said calmly, "I'm impressed. I didn't think you would find the inner chamber." Catherine rose slowly, stepping in front of Ezekiel. "You were supposed to be in Charleston." "I was supposed to be," Silas said. "But I never trusted your miraculous recovery. So I made arrangements. I left this morning, yes, but I returned this afternoon and watched the house all evening, waiting to see what you would do." Silas stepped fully into the chamber, the 2 men behind him closing off the exit. His voice was low, almost conversational. Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate this? That I wouldn't prepare for the possibility you might remember? Might seek revenge. You've been poisoning me for 16 years, Catherine said, her voice steady, despite everything. And you expect me to simply accept that? I expect you to understand. It was necessary, Silas replied. You saw something you should not have. A child cannot comprehend such things. I could not allow you to destroy everything. I was 12, Catherine said louder now, and I watched you murder a woman and eat her flesh. That was not fear, Father. That was a reasonable response to witnessing evil. Evil. Silas rolled the word on his tongue. Such a simple word for something older and deeper than you can imagine. His eyes flicked to Ezekiel. And you. Using my daughter to get to me, filling her head with ideas of revenge. Ezekiel said nothing. He was calculating distances and odds. 7 men against 1, Catherine in no condition to fight. The situation looked hopeless. Silas seemed to read his thoughts. Do not do anything foolish. I do not want to hurt either of you, not permanently, but I cannot have this rebellion continuing. He gestured to the men behind him. Bring them upstairs. We need to discuss what happens next. They were marched to Silas's study and locked inside together. The room had one high transom window, impossible to reach. The door was heavy oak, locked from the outside. As soon as they were alone, Catherine crossed to Ezekiel. Are you hurt? No, miss, he said quietly, but we're in serious trouble. Yes, she answered, but not as much as you think. She reached into her dress and pulled out a bundle. The papers they had been copying. I managed to keep these. He didn't search me. Too confident. That won't help if we're dead, Ezekiel said. We are not going to die. Not tonight. Catherine's eyes were sharp, calculating. My father will want to resolve this without killing me if he can. I am still his daughter. That gives us leverage. For the next hour, they heard arrivals and voices in the hall, men gathering, the brethren assembling. Finally, the door opened. Marcus Fanning stood there, face grim. They're ready for you. Come peacefully, and you won't be harmed. They were led back down to the cellar. This time, the main chamber had been transformed. All 13 brethren members were present, dressed in ritual robes. Candles burned in every holder. The altar was draped in crimson cloth. 13 chairs formed a perfect circle, all occupied except Silas's at the head. Ezekiel and Catherine were forced to stand in the center facing Silas. The others watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. Silas removed his hood. Brothers of the harvest, thank you for coming on such short notice. We face a crisis. My daughter and her associate discovered our inner chamber. They saw the ledger. They were copying entries when I interrupted them. Judge Pelam rose. Then they must be silenced permanently. This is not complicated. I disagree. Silas lifted a hand. My daughter is blood. I cannot simply dispose of her without exhausting other options. And the man represents an opportunity. What opportunity? Reverend Crenshaw asked. To test something I have long suspected, Silas said. That a person can be drawn into our work through their own actions, if framed correctly. He turned to Ezekiel. You want revenge on me? You want to destroy me for what I did to your family? I understand that. But what if I offered you a different kind of revenge, a more meaningful one? Ezekiel's voice was careful, measured. I do not understand. I am offering you membership, Silas said. Not as an equal. Silas's voice carried easily across the circle, smooth and poisonous. The Brethren does not accept men of color as full members. But as an associate, you would attend our gatherings, participate in our rituals. In exchange, I give you what you want most. Ezekiel's voice was flat. My family is dead. You cannot give me what I want." "No," Silas said softly. "But I can give you revenge against the people who killed them. The plantation owner in Alabama who worked your wife and children to death, Edward Gaines. He is not one of us. He has no protection from us. Join us. Prove your loyalty. I will give you everything you need to destroy him. Money, information, whatever it takes to make him suffer as you have suffered." The offer hung in the air, obscene in its calculation. Join the men who destroyed his family to get revenge on another monster. "And if I refuse?" Ezekiel asked. Silas's tone hardened. "Then you and Catherine both die tonight. Your bodies go into the swamp. No one will ever know what happened. The papers Catherine was copying burned. Her journals destroyed. Everything continues as it always has." He spread his hands. "But if you accept, you live. Catherine lives. You get your revenge. All it costs is your soul." Ezekiel looked at Catherine. Her face was pale but steady. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Do not do it. Whatever happens, do not become them." But Ezekiel was thinking about accepting, about getting inside, about gathering more evidence, about buying time. "What happens to her?" he asked finally. "She returns to her room," Silas said. "Resumes her medications, forgets what she has seen. The alternative is she dies alongside you." "No." Catherine's voice cut across the chamber. "I will not forget again. I will not be silenced. Kill me if you must, Father, but I will not pretend I do not know what you are." Silas's expression hardened. "Then you have made your choice." "Wait," Ezekiel said quickly. "I accept. But on one condition. Catherine goes free, not back to her room. Free. Let her leave this house. Leave South Carolina. Give her money to start over. If you do that, I will join you." Several Brethren members muttered, heads shaking. Judge Pelam rose. "The boy makes a point. The girl is already broken. Even if she spoke, who would believe her? But a man willing to join us to be complicit, that is valuable. That proves our power extends even to those who hate us." Silas studied Ezekiel for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Very well. Catherine will be sent north. I have associates in Philadelphia who will take her in. She will be given a new identity and a stipend to live on. But she can never return to South Carolina. Never contact anyone from her old life. She will be dead to everyone here." "Agreed," Ezekiel said. Catherine stared at him. "No, I will not leave you." "Agreed," Ezekiel interrupted, eyes never leaving Silas. "She goes free. I join you." "Then we have a bargain," Silas said. He turned to the others. "Catherine leaves tomorrow. Ezekiel's initiation will be in 3 weeks at the next regular gathering. Until then, he remains at Cypress Grove under watch. If he tries to escape or contact anyone, the deal is void and both die." "Understood." Ezekiel nodded. Catherine looked like she wanted to argue, but he caught her eye and gave a slight shake of his head. "Trust me." She left at dawn the next morning in a closed carriage, rolling down the long drive until it disappeared into the trees. She had not been allowed to say goodbye. He had not been allowed to speak with her after the confrontation in the cellar. But as she was escorted to her room the previous night, she had looked back at him once, and in her eyes, he saw something that gave him hope. She understood. She knew he had not truly surrendered. She knew this was strategy, not defeat. The 3 weeks that followed were the longest of Ezekiel's life. He was under constant watch, 2 overseers trailing him everywhere. He could not leave the plantation grounds. He was given meaningless tasks to keep him busy. Yet at the same time, he was granted access to the main house, to Silas's study, to the cellar where the next gathering would take place. They were watching him, yes, but they were also testing him, seeing if he would run, seeing if he would sabotage. Ezekiel did neither. He waited. He played the part of the defeated man who had chosen survival quiet and obedient, asking no questions and causing no trouble. But he watched everything learned. The house routines marked which slaves could be trusted, which overseers took pleasure in cruelty, and which brethren members visited most often, building a mental map of schedules, keys, and weak spots. At night alone in his cabin, he rehearsed what was coming, knowing his initiation would demand participation in their rituals and a test of loyalty that could force him to become complicit in horrors that would ruin him if he ever exposed them. And he tried to find a line he would not cross, and whether revenge could justify any act without a clear answer. On June 2nd, the night before his initiation, Silas knocked at his door after midnight and stepped into the spare room like a man delivering a verdict, telling him bluntly that tomorrow he would become one of them. Not fully but enough, and explaining what that meant. The brethren had existed for decades and never lost a member to exposure. Because everyone was equally guilty, and because they protected one another, doors opened. Legal troubles vanished, business favors arrived, enemies found misfortune, and in exchange for access to their network and the resources to get what he wanted. Ezekiel would be expected to help maintain their order, to accept that the strong ruled the weak, and to pay the terrible price of belonging. He stepped forward with the knife in his hand and felt every eye in that circle fix on him like a judge, his mouth dry, his hand steady, because he had to make them believe. And for a heartbeat, he almost heard only his own blood. Silas's voice cut through the chanting. Do it now, prove yourself. And Ezekiel thought of Sarah and Benjamin and Ruth and the paper with their names under his shirt. And then he did something none of them expected. He closed his fist around the blade, and with a single deliberate motion, he plunged it not into the girl's chest, but into the heavy altar cloth. The cut tearing open a square of fabric that bled crimson, because earlier, during the hours when he had been granted access to the cellar, he had found a sealed jar of animal blood and primed it to stain whatever he needed it to. And with fingers already smudged, he smeared the fabric and his own arms until the sight of red made the gathered men breathe a collective satisfied exhalation. Then, while their attention was on the false gore and the low chant swelled, he kicked a shelf so that a row of jars crashed and glass shattered. Smoke from a struck oil lamp flared, and in the very second the brethren lunged toward the chaos. 2 house slaves he had quietly warned and paid with whispered promises, and a few coins burst into the chamber from a hidden stair, cutting the young woman's bindings and hustling her toward the narrow passage Catherine had told him about. And Ezekiel, playing the part of a man who had just proven his willingness to spill blood, dropped to his knees as if overcome with grief. Let the robe dwellers think they had won. Let Silas see him wiped in symbolic blood, all while his heart hammered with a different victory. Because the girl slid past him and out into the dark, where the conspirators had planned a route, and when the smoke cleared and the brethren realized the disruption had not been a sacrilege, but a staged misdirection for a rescue, they were both enraged and impressed. And Silas, seeing Ezekiel kneeling alive in their manufactured stain, could only nod slowly and say, almost with respect, "So it begins," welcoming him into the fold, while Ezekiel swallowed the taste of that acceptance and the knowledge that now he could move inside them, learn their rhythms, bide his time, and use the mask of complicity to finish what he had started. Catherine did not flinch when Silas tightened the knife at her throat. She met his eyes and said, calm as a verdict, "Do it, kill me, it changes nothing. You have already lost." And that moment snapped whatever restraint remained in the men below. The enslaved surged like a single living thing into the cellar tools. Flashing voices a raw roar, and the brethren who had never borne honest labor found themselves battered by axes and hoes swung with a lifetime of anger behind them. Judge Pelam fell where he stood, a pistol useless in his hand. Reverend Crenshaw begged and then begged no more, and as blows ended his pleading, Marcus Fanning tried to run and was pulled back into the crush, and Silas still clutching. Catherine had his arm wrenched away by two strong hands and was struck so hard he crumpled against the altar. Ezekiel fought with a precision that made the privileged men look clumsy and exposed, ripping robes, throwing chairs. Using the very ritual space the brethren had sanctified as a battleground. And when the last of the 13 lay groaning, or still, the room fell into a heavy ash. Scented silence broken only by breathing and the creak of settling wood. They did not celebrate. There was no triumphal cry. Only the slow, terrible work of making sure the brethren could never rise again, of finding the ledger and tearing its pages free before dragging it into the light so others could see the names and dates that had fed their nightmares for decades. And then, because evidence would not be enough on its own, because the county would try to bury the truth as it always did. They set the ledger and the robes and the altar cloth to flame and watched the smoke climb a black ribbon toward the stars. While Catherine stood in the doorway, breathing like someone who had been underwater for too long, Ezekiel at her side. And as dawn eased over Cypress Grove, the people who had come with her disappeared into the swamps and the fields, carrying the memory of what had been taken, leaving behind a ruined house, a burned ledger, and a truth that could not be fully buried again. Ezekiel stared at the woman on the altar, and in her eyes saw every enslaved person who had ever suffered under men like the brethren. He saw Sarah Benjamin. Ruth, he saw himself, and he felt the knife heavy in his hand, the moment splitting into two clear choices: become a monster or die resisting. But he had a third plan he had rehearsed for 3 weeks, and with a sudden brutal motion, he drove the blade not into the woman, but into the nearest brethren member. Blood spraying as chaos exploded, he tore robes, plunged through the crowd, cut the woman's bonds, and screamed, "Run!" while smoke and shattered glass and overturned candles turned the ritual chamber into a war zone above them. Catherine, who had never gone to Philadelphia, but had spent weeks recruiting allies among the enslaved, heard the commotion, saw the young woman flee, and led 23 people armed with tools from the fields into the cellar. The tide of the enslaved crashed over the brethren with no mercy. Judge Pelam tried to fire and fell. Reverend Crenshaw begged and was silenced. Marcus Fanning was dragged back into the room. Silas tried a last desperate move, grabbing Catherine and holding a knife to her throat, and she met him with a calm that was like a verdict. "Do it? Kill me. It changes nothing. You have already lost," which broke whatever restraint remained and unleashed the full force of people who had been told their lives had no value. They struck with axes and hoes. They battered and beat the men who had thought themselves untouchable when the fighting ended. The brethren lay groaning or still, and the cellar was heavy with ash and blood and the stench of burnt cloth. There was no cheering, only the grim work of making sure those men could never rise again. They found the ledger, tore its pages, and dragged it into the light, where names and dates made the nightmare real. But Catherine argued burning was necessary because proof in official hands would only get buried, and the network in other counties would come for them. So they poured oil-stacked wood, arranged the bodies to look like accident and Ezekiel before they lit. The blaze tore out the pages that named his family and tucked them into his shirt so at least Sarah Benjamin and Ruth would not be entirely forgotten. Then Catherine set the match and the fire took instantly, the flames swallowing ledger and robes and altar, while they stood in the yard and watched Cypress Grove burn as smoke climbed into the morning sky. They agreed on plans. Ezekiel would go west to disappear and help others escape. Catherine would head north toward Charleston, and then Philadelphia. She would hide and code the truth, to be found decades later when it could no longer do harm. They stayed until the house was ash and blackened timbers and then walked away in opposite directions. They never saw each other again. The official story became a tragic accident. 13 gentlemen and one mad daughter, trapped by a candle and an unwise hour funerals, with honors and eulogies followed. No one asked too many questions, the enslaved who had helped. Scattered and kept silence for survival, most were sold and carried the secret to their graves. Cypress Grove was demolished, the land sold new buildings, Rose life covered the past, but whispers persisted in slave quarters late at night about the plantation that burned and the names that would not be erased. They called it the night justice came for men who believed themselves untouchable. A night when a woman and a man stood together against power and cruelty and won. The story changed in each retelling, growing into legend, into myth. But its core remained unshaken. Cruelty had consequences. Power was never absolute, and sometimes the powerless discovered they had the most dangerous power of all. In 1863, Union troops passed through the ruins of Cypress Grove. They found tunnels beneath the property bones in the swamp. Strange markings on trees that hinted at rituals. But the war pushed on, and no one stayed to investigate. In 1971, demolition workers uncovered a journal sealed in a wall. It contained names, dates, rituals, and victims. The code Catherine had promised. Before it could be fully deciphered, the book vanished from county records. Some claim it was destroyed. Others whisper it was taken by descendants of the Brethren, desperate to protect their family names. And a few still believe it survives, hidden, waiting for the right moment to resurface. What history records is simple in 1841? 13 prominent men died in a fire at Cypress Grove. Catherine Rutledge supposedly perished with them, the mad daughter trapped in a room. An enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross was later reported sold to Alabama, though no record of the sale was ever found. Yet for decades afterward, stories spread through the quarter stories of a network that helped people escape, led by a man who had faced the monsters and lived. Were those stories true, or were they hope carried on whispers in the night? No one can say. But truth is not always in official records. Sometimes it lives in memory, in defiance, in the stories the oppressed tell when the masters are gone. Cypress Grove teaches us this power built on cruelty is never as solid as it seems. Secrets buried in darkness eventually claw their way into the light. And those called powerless often hold the one weapon their oppressors fear most, the power to witness, to remember, to refuse to forget. So what do you think? Was the truth of Cypress Grove really buried forever? Do you believe Catherine's journal still exists, waiting to be uncovered? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you want more stories where history and horror intertwine, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the bell so you never miss a tale. And share this with someone who loves mysteries too dark for the history books. Because some stories need to be remembered, some voices need to be heard. And we'll see you in the next video.